Introduction. Welcome to what it was really like during the Black Plague and more, where we step into one of the darkest and most devastating times in history, the Black Plague. A pandemic that killed millions, spread fear, and changed the course of European history forever. In this episode, we will take a calm, measured look at the suffering endured by the masses, the actions of the powerful, and the mystery that still surrounds the plague's origins. As we explore this tragic chapter of the past, let the steady rhythm of the narrative guide you through the centuries-old horrors, offering you a glimpse of a world where death lurked at every corner and survival seemed uncertain. Now, let us begin our journey into the past, to a time when Europe was gripped by fear, and the Black Plague left its mark on every life it touched. Segment 1. Why it sucked to live during the Black Plague. The year is 1347, and Europe is on the brink of disaster. Imagine yourself living in a crowded town or village, where people live in close quarters, and the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting food. The streets are narrow, the houses cramped and poorly constructed. There is no concept of sanitation. Waste is discarded in open pits, and rats roam freely. Little do the people know that in the coming months, a catastrophe will unfold that will change their world forever. The Black Plague, a disease carried by fleas that infested rats, spreads rapidly through the crowded streets, infecting people at an alarming rate. The first signs are subtle fever, chills, and aching joints. But then, the swelling begins. Large, painful lumps appear on the lymph nodes, known as buboes, often in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes grow quickly, turning black and oozing pus. The air grows thick with the stench of death. Infected people become delirious, their bodies racked with fever, and they die within days, sometimes hours. It is impossible to keep up with the bodies piling up, and soon, entire families are wiped out. The streets are littered with the dead, and those still alive must navigate through the corpses, trying to avoid the inevitable. For the living, it becomes a race against time, to avoid the disease. If you don't fall ill, you live in constant fear of touching anything, fear of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. No one knows what causes the plague or how to stop it. Entire communities collapse under the weight of the disease. There are not enough people left to bury the dead, so bodies are left in the streets or hastily thrown into mass graves. There is no time for mourning. Fear is contagious, and soon the towns are filled with panic, and the very structure of society begins to break down. Those who can afford it flee to the countryside or seek refuge in isolated places, but there is no true escape from the plague. It is everywhere, haunting every corner of Europe. The Black Plague changes everything. It alters the course of history, wiping out a third of Europe's population. The social fabric disintegrates. Families, villages, and towns are forever altered. The survivors are left to pick up the pieces, but the fear and trauma of those years will haunt them for generations. This concludes the first segment, where we've witnessed the horrors that gripped Europe during the Black Plague, pain, death, and a world plunged into chaos. As we leave behind the suffering of the let us now focus on a figure who faced the plague in a very different way. Pope Clement VI. How did he lead through the storm, and what role did he play in comforting the people? Let us explore his life and actions.
Amidst the overwhelming suffering and chaos of the Black Plague, a singular figure stands apart, Pope Clement VI. While death and disease ravaged the streets, Pope Clement VI remained relatively untouched, leading the Church with a mix of controversial decisions, faith, and diplomacy. His life during the plague offers a sharp contrast to the devastation faced by the common people. But what did it mean for the Pope to remain in his palace while millions around him perished? What actions did he take, and what impact did they have on the Church and the people? Pope Clement VI, born Pierre Raja in 1291, ascended to the papacy in 1342, just a few years before the plague struck. As the disease spread through Europe in 1347, Clement found himself in a difficult position. The people of Europe, gripped by fear and suffering, looked to him for guidance. But the Pope, instead of fleeing or appearing publicly to mourn alongside his people, chose a different path. He remained in Avignon, where the papacy was based at the time, staying in the safety of his lavish palace. Why did he stay? There were many who criticized his decision, calling him out for his distance from the suffering of his flock. Yet, from Clement's perspective, there was a pragmatic reason for his decision. In his eyes, the papacy needed to be a stable, guiding force during this crisis, not a figurehead swept away by panic. The Pope believed that by staying in Avignon, he could continue to lead the Church, make decisions, and comfort the faithful from a position of authority. His health and safety were vital for maintaining the continuity of the Church, a key institution in a time of such uncertainty. Pope Clement VI took action to address the spiritual and practical needs of his people. One of his first measures was to offer spiritual comfort to those suffering. He issued papal indulgences to those who were afflicted by the plague, offering them a reprieve from their sins if they gave charity or prayed. This move was intended to ease the anxiety of the population, who believed the plague to be divine punishment. By extending God's mercy through the Church, Clement sought to give people a sense of hope amidst the despair. Yet, despite his attempts to provide comfort, the Pope was not immune to the fear that gripped Europe. He also took drastic steps to protect himself and his court. Clement VI made sure his palace was sealed off, with strict quarantines in place to prevent any possible exposure to the plague. He even took to sitting in a specially constructed room, where he could meet with his advisors and handle church matters from a safe distance. His actions reflected the fear that even the highest in society had for the plague, a fear that gripped both the common people and the elite. Despite his isolation, Pope Clement VI made efforts to guide his people through the darkness. In 1348, he issued a papal bull known as Unigenitus, calling for prayers for the end of the plague. He encouraged Christians to come together in their faith, invoking God's mercy to put an end to the devastation. His words were meant to reassure the faithful and maintain order during a time when chaos and panic reigned. Yet, despite his spiritual and political efforts, the Pope's decisions were not without controversy. His decision to stay in Avignon was criticized by some as cowardice, while others saw it as a necessary step for preserving the Church. While the masses suffered in the streets, the Pope was seen as a distant figure, removed from the daily realities of plague-ridden life. But for Clement, the role of the papacy was far greater than personal safety. It was a matter of spiritual leadership and the preservation of an institution that had to endure, even in the face of calamity. The paradox of Pope Clement VI's papacy during the Black Plague is clear. While he remained physically separated from the suffering of his people, his actions and words were meant to provide spiritual solace. He represented the Church's unwavering strength in a time of profound uncertainty. In his own way, he guided Europe through the plague, though his position, his decisions, and his physical isolation from the people would forever remain a subject of debate. As we close this chapter on Pope Clement VI's leadership during the Black Plague, we turn our attention to the origins of the plague itself, a mystery that still remains unresolved to this day. The origins of the Black Plague, its spread, and its devastating consequences are some of the most hotly debated topics in historical studies. Was it truly a natural disaster, or was it something more? Let us now unravel the mystery of the plague's origins.
The Black Plague, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, remains one of the most mysterious and catastrophic events in human history. While we know the disease, it caused bubonic plague, there is still much debate about its true origins, and how it spread so rapidly across the continents. How did such a small, seemingly innocuous creature as the flea bring about one of the deadliest pandemics the world has ever seen? And why, even after all these years, do questions about its origins continue to stir historians and scientists alike? The most widely accepted explanation for the Black Plague's spread is that it was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is carried by fleas that infest rats. The fleas would bite infected rats, then jump onto humans, where they would transmit the bacteria into the bloodstream. The symptoms of the plague were gruesome and unmistakable swelling of the lymph nodes, fever, chills, and in many cases, death within days of infection. But where did this deadly bacterium come from? Some historians believe that the Black Plague originated in China, in the heart of the Mongol Empire, in the early 1300s. The Mongols, known for their vast empire and rapid movement, are thought to have played a key role in the plague spread. The Silk Road, a network of trade routes that connected China with the Mediterranean, was a critical conduit for goods and, unfortunately, disease. Fleas carried by rats could have traveled along these routes, hitching a ride on merchant caravans and ships, eventually reaching Europe. By 1347, the plague reached the shores of Europe, brought by traders and ships arriving in the port of Messina in Sicily. From there, it spread quickly, moving across Italy, France, and the rest of Europe. The rapid spread of the disease can be attributed to several factors: the sheer density of Europe's population at the time, the lack of effective quarantine measures, and the mobility of people and goods along trade routes. Cities, already crowded and unsanitary, were ripe environments for the plague to thrive. Despite this widely accepted theory, some questions remain. How did the disease first appear in China? Was it truly the result of a naturally occurring bacterium, or was it brought about by human actions? In recent years, some historians and researchers have suggested that the plague might have been deliberately spread, either as a biological weapon or through human manipulation. The idea of biological warfare during this time may seem anachronistic, but there are records that suggest the Mongols used plague-infected bodies as weapons, catapulting them over the walls of besieged cities, spreading the disease through the air and on the ground. Another theory involves the possibility of different strains of the plague, some of which might have been more virulent than others. The bacterium Yersinia pestis itself can mutate, and some scientists have suggested that the specific strain that emerged in the 14th century may have been especially lethal, or that it could have interacted with other diseases to increase its deadliness. Yet another theory revolves around the environmental conditions that could have contributed to the plague's spread. For instance, a period of cooling known as the Little Ice Age led to poor harvests and malnutrition in Europe. These conditions made people more susceptible to disease. In addition, changes in animal populations, particularly rats and fleas, could have created the perfect environment for the plague to spread uncontested. Despite the many theories, the origins of the Black Plague remain shrouded in mystery. What we do know is that the disease spread rapidly across Europe and caused an unprecedented death toll. It wiped out nearly one-third of Europe's population, forever changing the social, political, and economic landscape. But the question of where it came from and how it arrived remains a subject of intense debate among historians and scientists. The clues are scattered across time, buried in ancient texts, archaeological findings, and genetic studies, but the true origins of the plague are still elusive. Now, having explored the mystery of the plague's origins, we turn our attention to a stark contrast: the elite, the wealthy, and the powerful in medieval Europe. How did they fare during the Black Plague, and how did their lives differ from those of the common people? While millions perished in the streets, the elite lived relatively untouched by the disease. Let us now look at how the rich and powerful navigated the plague in comfort, often remaining insulated from the horrors that plagued them. While Europe was ravaged by the Black Plague, with towns, villages, and entire regions falling to the disease, there was a stark contrast in the way the elite experienced the crisis. For the wealthy and powerful, life during the plague was often one of relative luxury and safety, a privilege that shielded them from the horrors that unfolded in the streets below, in stark contrast to the suffering of the common people. The elite lived in isolation, often untouched by the disease, continuing their lives in relative comfort. Imagine the grand estates of medieval lords, vast mansions surrounded by well-maintained gardens, and large stone walls that kept out not only the plague but the poor and the desperate. Inside these walls, the lords and ladies of Europe lived a life that was markedly different from that of the mass. They were able to flee to their countryside estates, away from the overcrowded, unsanitary cities where the plague spread most rapidly. This separation gave them a kind of immunity from the disease that was unavailable to those who remained behind in the cities. These wealthy individuals, many of whom had large private households, servants, and land, could afford to isolate themselves completely. They had the resources to hire doctors, although these doctors, working with little knowledge of the plague's true causes, could do little to help. They could lock themselves away in their castles and palaces, away from the threat of contamination, enjoying fine meals and entertainment, while those outside their walls suffered. Even if someone in their household fell ill, the elite could afford to keep them at a distance, ensuring that their lives continued without much disruption, while the poor were forced to endure overcrowded, disease-ridden conditions in the streets. The elite could rely on their wealth to shield them from the worst effects of the plague. They could purchase the finest food with imported delicacies from across Europe, while the common people scavenged for scraps. The lords and ladies could afford to indulge in music, dancing, and lavish banquets, with attendants waiting on them, hand and foot. These events, far removed from the death and devastation outside their doors, provided an illusion of normalcy in a time of chaos. Yet, despite their insulation from the worst effects of the plague, the elite were not entirely unaffected. The economic collapse caused by the Black Plague did not spare them. While many of the nobility were able to protect their fortunes, the long-term effects of the plague still had an impact. With such a large portion of the population lost, the labor force was decimated, and feudal economies, reliant on the work of peasants, began to crumble. Some nobles, facing a loss of income and the collapse of traditional systems, found themselves in financial ruin. Even so, the elite were able to weather the storm much more effectively than the common people. They were able to maintain their positions of power, even as the plague decimated the ranks of the peasantry. For them, the plague was more an inconvenience than a life-threatening disaster. In some cases, the elite even prospered, consolidating land and resources as the population shrank, further cementing their dominance. This disparity between the rich and the poor during the Black Plague highlights a fundamental aspect of medieval society: the deep divisions between the social classes. The elites were able to avoid the worst consequences of the plague through their wealth and position, while the common people had no such protection. The poor faced overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and the constant threat of death. The wealthy, on the other hand, could retreat into their fortified estates, away from the ravages of the disease, and continue their lives as though nothing had changed. As the years passed, and Europe began to rebuild in the wake of the plague, the social and economic landscape was forever altered. The death toll among the working class led to labor shortages, and eventually contributed to the decline of the feudal system. The elite may have escaped the full brunt of the plague, but they could not escape the lasting effects it had on the world around them. The balance of power was shifting, and the world would never be the same again. As we conclude this journey through the Black Plague, we reflect on the stark contrasts in the lives of the common people and the elite. For the peasants, it was a time of unimaginable loss and suffering, while for the wealthy it was a time of isolation and continued luxury. The Black Plague was a disaster that did not discriminate in its spread, but the ways in which it impacted different classes could not have been more different. The echoes of the plague still reverberate in our world today, from the mysteries of its origins to the stories of those who lived through it. The Black Plague remains one of history's most haunting chapters, but as we turn the page on this dark time, we can also find hope in the resilience of humanity. The world may have been forever changed by the plague, but life moved forward, as it always does. This concludes our exploration of what it was really like during the Black Plague and more. I hope you have found this journey through history both fascinating and insightful. Let the calm rhythm of the past fade as you drift into a peaceful rest, knowing that the stories of the Black Plague will continue to intrigue and teach us for generations to come.